Hi, my name is Dave Ferguson. I'm the visionary leader for New Thing. I'm also the president of Exponential Conference in the USA, and also proud to be a part of the board of Exponential Europe. I want to start with Ephesians chapter 4, verses 11 and 12, a familiar passage, but I think it's so important to set the foundation for where we're going to head. And what I believe that I'm going to share with you will be strategically helpful and just very practical to real life ministry. And it says this in Ephesians 4, "So Christ himself gave the apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, and teachers to equip his people for works of service." Just a reminder there again, okay? God gave us a job description, and right at the top it says equip. Equip your people. Train your people. Give them the tools. And so my question for you, and I want you to reflect on this, what is your strategy to equip your people? What is your strategy for training folks? How are you going to do that? How are you going to equip? So what I want to do in the remainder of the time that we have is I want to give you a couple stories I want to tell, and then I want to give you three tools. Three tools that you can use personally as soon as we get done. They're that simple. Simple enough you can actually write these on the back of a napkin. Okay, so they're simple and reproducible. But also then tools, because they're reproducible, you'll be able to pass on to your leaders and pass on to your people. Let me start with the first story. This first story is about a friend of mine named Troy. I remember when Troy showed up at Community Christian Church, the church I planted, the church I still lead to this day. He showed up at Naperville Central High School's cafeteria because when we first started, we were actually meeting in the high school cafeteria. Troy's one of these guys, when he walks in the room, just big personality, right? Big personality, kind of a big guy. And immediately you kind of go like, what's with that guy? I got to meet him. And I remember meeting Troy, and pretty soon we're having breakfast together. And I asked Troy if he would be the apprentice in my small group. Troy was the apprentice in my small group when we started using this tool that I'll share with you in a little bit called the 5 steps. Now, most of the people in that small group that we were actually in were people who were far from God. And to be honest with you, there were some nights where we'd get together and I wasn't sure if we were going to win the conversation because they were kind of pulling in a dark direction. But it was a remarkable group where we saw so many people find their way back to God and say yes to Jesus. But Troy was my apprentice, and I took him through the 5 steps to the place where he eventually said he was ready to be a leader. And one of the ways we know someone is ready to be a small group leader at Community is when they think they're ready, and whoever the person that's apprenticing them, who's leading them, also thinks they're ready. We both thought he was ready, and so he began to lead that group. So he'd gone from being an individual in our church to an apprentice leader, and now he was a leader. For the next year, he led that group, but he also apprenticed someone else. He apprenticed someone else and reproduced that group. In fact, he began to do it over the next couple of years several times, so much so that he moved and he began to coach those leaders as a volunteer coach. He would check in with them, make sure their group was going well, that they were apprenticing people. So he went from being an individual to an apprentice to a leader to a coach. And as a coach, he began to use what we call the 6 coaching questions, another tool that I'm going to give you in a moment. So when we finally got to the place as a church that we grew and we wanted to move to become multiple locations, rather than looking at the local seminary or checking on churchstaffing.com, we looked at our leadership pathway. Who are the people who have been the most faithful through this leadership path? Individual, apprentice, leader, and coach. And Troy's name. I was like, Troy? What if we asked Troy to be our first site pastor for our brand new site? I remember having a conversation with Troy, actually over a milkshake, a memorable conversation. Challenged him with the idea of quitting his job at General Mills, where he was kind of a golden boy on the fast track. And he went home, talked to his wife Janet about it. And not only did he quit his job, but he began to raise some of his own support so he could join our team as a director, be a staff member. Fast forward several years, a couple of years later, then he actually planted that first site. He planted that first site. And I remember the first gathering we had there, we had about 9 folks show up. And we're like, oh man, this is going to be good. We ought to have more people than that. But we had the right leader. And having the right leader over time, I mean, when we launched with several hundred people, and it was remarkable, just remarkable. So Troy not only started that location, that site, we started another site later on for us at Community. And after being together for over a decade, I remember Troy came to me and said, you know what, I think I want to go plant a church. He wanted to go plant a church back in his hometown of Kansas City, Missouri. So we sent him and about 25 people and and some resources, financial resources, and he planted that church in Kansas City, now over 10 years ago. It was at the 10-year anniversary. Troy asked me to come there and be with them and actually speak. And I'll tell you what, it was so, so good to be there. Because together we got to celebrate that while he was there, that church that he planted actually went to multiple locations. Actually, Troy was now leading a network of churches there. And those churches had planted over 40 churches in those 10 years together. Now, I tell you that story because that story illustrates the importance of the first tool I want to give you, which is called a leadership path. I would encourage you to have a well thought out leadership path. And our leadership path at community is very simple. You can write it on the back of a napkin. Individual like Troy can show up. They can move into an apprentice role as apprentice leader, whether it's our in Kid City, or whether it's our student community, or whether it's adult ministry. They can move from an apprentice then to a leadership role. And once they begin to reproduce other leaders, they can then move into a coaching role where they coach those folks. And then for some people, they actually will come on staff and assume a director role. And then from a director, they can actually then become either a community pastor, which leads one of our locations, or go out and plant a church. Troy did both those things. And then maybe even in time, become a network leader. And what Troy did in a span of about 20 years is he went and went all the way through that whole leadership path. Now, one of the great things about having a leadership path, and I can remember several times sitting down with young leaders, and you could see the enthusiasm, you could see the excitement in their eyes for the mission. And I said, well, you know what? Here's what we could do. If you will start as an apprentice leader, in times you can become a leader, and then a coach, and then a director, and then maybe a community pastor, a church planter, or even a network leader. And you could see their eyes just begin to expand, because it's like right before them, you're able to articulate the path to making their dream happen. You're able to articulate the path to making the dream, for the impact, the influence they want to have happen. It is a really great tool. So one of the tools, I'm telling you, if you want to equip your people, have a leadership path. Show them where they could go. Show them the difference they could make in this church and for the kingdom of God. Let me give you a second tool. The second tool that Troy and I used, particularly when he was my apprentice leader in my small group, is what we call the 5 steps of apprenticeship. The 5 steps of apprenticeship is probably, for many of you, you've probably heard this before, but here's the problem. Okay, before you turn it off in a moment here and go like, oh, I already know this. Let me ask you this. Have you actually ever done it? Have you actually ever used it? Because it's one thing to know it, but have you actually ever used it? We use it over and over and over again in all areas of ministry, and it makes a huge difference. And here's the 5 steps. And again, simple enough, you can write it on the back of a napkin. The first step is this. I do, you watch, and then we talk. I do, you watch, and then we talk. So for example, when Troy was my apprentice first starting out, I led the whole small group. I did, he watched, but then we'd get together, and we'd get together for breakfast, and we'd talk about it. We'd talk about what worked, what didn't work, and what could improve. That's what we did. And the we talk part, don't forget that. You want to debrief. That's really, really important. That's where the learning takes place. That's the first step. The second step then is I do, you help, and then we talk. And so soon with Troy, I was still primarily leading, but maybe I would turn part of the lesson over to him. Hey, why don't you take this part of the conversation? And he would lead that part of the conversation. And then afterwards, we'd go out for breakfast and we would talk about it, like the next day. That second step was I do, you help, and then we talk. Then the third step, this is where you make a big shift. And this is what I did with Troy. The third step was you do, I help, and then we talk. So for example, then Troy would lead most of the small group, but he might still give me the last word. Maybe I would just lead the prayer time. And then afterwards we would debrief over breakfast or some other place, and we'd talk about, okay, what worked, what didn't work, and what can we improve? Then came the fourth step. The fourth step was simply this: you do, I watch, I'm only observing, and then we talk. And so with Troy, what I did is eventually I said, okay, now you do the whole thing. I'm just sitting back and watching. I'd go to the group, I was there at the group, but Troy was leading the whole small group. And then afterwards we get together and debrief. That's the fourth step. Then the fifth step is simply this. The fifth step is you do, you bring somebody else, I step completely back, you bring somebody else in, and they watch. That way it adds the multiplier effect of the whole thing. And I'm telling you, if you will use these simple 5 steps, not just know them, but actually use them, it is the catalytic thing that allows you to begin multiplying disciples, multiplying leaders, multiplying groups and teams. And when you begin to multiply micro, I'm telling you, over time you'll begin to multiply macro. Use that tool. That's the second tool I have for you. So the first tool I had for you is the leadership path. Second tool was 5 steps of apprenticeship. Let me give you a third tool. The third tool I'll give you is what I call the 6 coaching questions. So when Troy moved to that leadership path, he moved from being an individual to an apprentice leader, and then a leader, and then a coach. Now as a coach, I used this with him, and then he began to use these with someone else, and they're called the 6 coaching questions. And the 6 coaching questions are questions that, honestly, I not only use it with small group leaders, but I use it with church planners. I use it with lots of different people. I tried using it with my wife. Didn't work so well there, so I don't recommend that. But these 6 coaching questions, if you remember them, they can be used at any time, and you're always ready to do leadership development. And you know how it is. Sometimes you have a meeting with somebody, you have a one-on-one with another leader that you're supposed to be developing, and man, you haven't got your thoughts together. I'm telling you, if you have this, you're always ready to help that leader take the next step. So here's the 6 coaching questions you can use anytime, and it's simple enough. Again, you can put on the back of a napkin. Question number 1: how are you doing? How are you doing? You've heard it said before, but people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. Check in with them, ask them, how are you doing? That's the first question in a one-on-one, a coaching session with another leader. Ask them, how are you doing? Because here's the deal. If something's not great in their work life, if something's not going great in their marriage, or if they have kids and they're having a hard time with one of their kids, it's going to be hard for them to focus on the task at hand until you deal with what else is going on in life. So check in with them relationally. Just say, hey, how you doing? And don't let them just say, fine. No, I want to know, how are you doing? Because you're building a genuine friendship there. The second question that you ask, here's the second of the 6 coaching questions, is what are you celebrating? What are you celebrating? I think this is an important question because a lot of times in the church world, we don't give people the opportunity to kind of talk about the things that are really going well. It kind of feels like we're bragging on ourselves. But by asking the question, you get a chance for them to kind of say, no, here's this good stuff. Here's what happened with my at work, or here's what my kid did last week, or whatever the thing is. And you celebrate that together. Rejoice with those who rejoice. That's the second question. Then the third question, and you're getting a little more down to business now. What are the challenges? What are the challenges? What are the challenges you're currently facing in your ministry? And this is not just for small group leaders. This is also going to be for you're working with people who are in children's ministry or kids ministry or student ministry. You can also work in the arts. This works anywhere. This works in the business world, anywhere. But ask them, what are the challenges? What are and what you're doing here is you're taking an adult learning style approach to leadership development. Because instead of you setting the curriculum, what you're doing is you're letting them set the curriculum. Because when they begin to tell you, hey, here's the challenge, here's the thing I'm struggling with, they have set the agenda and they are a ready, eager learner because they're stuck on something here and I got to get it figured out. So ask that question. That's the third question. What are the challenges right now? The fourth question. This is the most strategic question. The most strategic question, okay? Ask them this. What are you going to do? Everything inside of you is going to want to solve it for them. Everything inside of you is going to be like, oh, I know this one. I know how to fix this one. I've come up against this before myself. Every part of you is going to fix it. Don't fix it. First of all, you have to ask them, what are you going to do? Let them work through it. Let them process it. Because what you want them to do is you're training them to solve these problems, not just for you to be the answer man. And you stay with that for a long time, but then eventually, then you get to the fifth question. The fifth question was, okay, how can I help? How can I help? And you want them to request help. You don't want to just put it on them, but you ask them to request help. And then if there's ways that they have not already discovered where you can be a help because of your own experience and your wisdom, then you help them. And you help solve that. Then the last question is this. How can I pray for you? That's how you end the meeting. The one-on-one, it's a great time of leadership development with those 6 coaching questions, but how can I pray for you? I'd encourage you to jot it down somewhere. Maybe it's on your phone. You pray for them and you come back to them. And then the next time you're together and you say, hey, how you doing? You can also ask them, hey, I've been praying for you about this. What's the update on that? But I'm telling you, you can use those 6 coaching questions to equip your people. So there's 3 tools: the leadership path, the 5 steps to apprenticeship, and the 6 coaching questions. Let me wrap up with another story. Patrick's a guy who first came to Community Christian, the church that I pastor. He came mostly just because his wife had recently started coming. She had been kind of on her own spiritual search. She'd come to the place where she believed Jesus was who he said he was, and she was going to be baptized. And because she was going to be baptized by a friend of hers, she went to Patrick, her husband, and said, hey, I want you to come to church with me. Just come this Sunday because I'm going to be baptized. So Patrick wants to be a good husband. He's not interested in spiritual things, certainly not interested in church, but he does show up just to be supportive of her. Sees her get baptized. Also is seeing her life change, seeing how she's being transformed into something different, which he really likes. And so he begins his own search. Just all out. Okay, if Jesus really is who he said he was, it'll prove itself to be true. He's a super bright guy. He actually not only begins coming to church, but actually joins a small group to search out this truth. He searches out this truth, and he also comes to the place where he says, you know what? I think this Jesus was who he said he was. It actually happened in the context of a small group. Patrick decides to get baptized. Patrick gets baptized. As he's being baptized, we do it by immersion, as he's being baptized, coming up out of the water, the person who's his small group leader, a guy named Scott, looks at Patrick and says, hey, Patrick, I see in you somebody who could be a really good leader. He's literally still dripping wet. He's still dripping wet from the baptistry. He says, I would like for you to be my apprentice leader. Patrick says, okay. So now Patrick is starting his journey, right, on the leadership path, going from being an individual to now an apprentice leader. Scott begins to use those same 5 steps of apprenticeship with Patrick. Patrick goes through those 5 steps of apprenticeship. He gets to the place where he thinks he could lead. I could lead this group. Scott thinks he could lead this group, and he takes over the group and he starts leading the group. Patrick gets a brand new apprentice. He takes the next step on that leadership path. As he takes the next step on the leadership path with an apprentice leader, he uses the 5 steps of apprenticeship. He uses those 5 steps of apprenticeship and he reproduces several times. He steps into a coaching role. As a coach, he starts using those 6 coaching questions with the leaders that he is coaching, the very ones that I told you about. Remember I told you about Troy at the beginning? Troy, when he decides to go plant a church in Kansas City, Troy goes to Patrick, taps Patrick on the shoulder and says, hey, Patrick, I'm going to Kansas City to plant a church. I know you got a job in wealth management, but about 15 years ago, Dave came to me and asked me to leave my job and raise my own support to come on the team. I would love for you to leave your job in wealth management, raise your own support, and join me and plant a church in Kansas City. And Patrick says yes. I still remember the day when Patrick, he found me in a Starbucks. I think it was just by accident. And he started telling me that Troy had asked him to go to Kansas City with him. And I do remember going like, oh my goodness, you quit your job, you're going to do this? I was kind of worried about this whole thing, like maybe this is really getting out of hand. But he goes to Kansas City to be a part of that church planting team. I told you about Troy, right? They went there, went to multiple locations. Over that first decade, they planted 40 churches in Kansas City. Patrick's a part of all that. Meanwhile, I'm leading this church planting network called New Thing that keeps growing. I called Troy. I said, you know what, Troy? we need someone to kind of lead all of New Thing. I think Patrick's the guy. Troy says, I think you're right. Patrick leaves Kansas City, comes back to Chicago. He becomes the global director of New Thing. New Thing now has 388, I think, networks around the world and like 6,000 churches that are committed to reproducing. And the person that is leading them is Patrick O'Connell. Someone who started out, very first time he came to church, it was only because his wife was being baptized. And he goes through the whole leadership path, right? All the way from being an individual and apprentice leader, all the way now where he's the global director of a global church planting movement. And I say all this, I tell you those stories, and I give you those tools for this reason. There are those kinds of people in your church, in your auditorium, people that are waiting for you, like Patrick, like Troy, just to equip them with these kind of tools and then release them. Remember that. Christ gave us, right? Us church leaders, apostles, prophets, evangelists, shepherds, pastors, teachers, right? To equip. To equip. Now go and equip them.